right, everybody is filtering in. Welcome, everybody.
So good to see the names trickling in.
There you go. Jenny, feel free to kick off whenever you'd like to.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first webinar of the 2024-2025 year. My name is Jenny Nessenjuk. I am the chair of the webinar committee. And today we are extremely lucky to have Indeed with us to present on trends and insights for 2024. I'm just going to do a little introduction of our presenter, Matt Berndt. So he is the Senior Program Manager and Head of Job Search Academy at Indeed. Matt has been helping people get jobs for nearly 30 years. Presently, he is the career strategist leading Indeed's Job Search Academy, a job search readiness and education program for job seekers to help them get jobs and manage their careers. Prior to his current role, Matt built and scaled Indeed's Executive Briefing Center program, the Indeed Idea Center, executing executive briefings with talent acquisition leaders for more than 800 enterprise employers in 29 countries. Prior to joining Indeed, Matt worked in the staffing industry with Randstad and in college and university career services at the University of Texas at Austin, the University of Southern California, and St. Edward's University, and served on the boards of the National Association of Colleges and Employers and the Southern Association of Colleges and Employers. Let's give Matt a very warm Eastern Ace welcome.
Jenny, thank you so very much. It's wonderful to be here today. And I am joined, as you can see on screen, I believe, by my colleague, Bridget Power. Bridget is part of the Job Search Academy team. She's also a resident of the Northeast up in Philadelphia, having completed her PhD in career development as well. We're thrilled to be here. And as we dig into this data inside the minds of the U.S. workforce, I want to share a little housekeeping before we get started. There's a lot of tools that are at your disposal, and Bridget and I are really going to be tag teaming this. I encourage you to use the chat tool to exchange ideas or questions or share thoughts with each other as you would when you're sitting next to someone at a conference, and perhaps to ask questions. Another way you can ask questions is by using the Q&A tool. Bridget will be monitoring that, and if it's just some informational stuff, she might just give you answers directly in response to the question there, but she might hold some of those questions for me, and she has got permission to interrupt me at any time when she sees a question that comes along that's really important that we need to address at the time. And the third way that you can interact with us and stay engaged in this program is simply by raising your hand. When you use that raise your hand tool, a little hand pops up next to your name in the participant roster, and that is our cue. That is mostly Bridget's cue because she's paying attention to that for me to seek out your questions. So if there's something that you think is very pertinent to the immediate topic at hand, raise your hand, and then we can invite you into the conversation. Heck, we can even unmute you and allow you to have a little dialogue. But also, please feel free to use the Q&A, use the chat. If you like what's going on, I think there's reactions. Let's keep this as interactive as possible. Otherwise, it's just me talking at you for the next hour. Shall we dig in to the contents that we have here inside the minds of the US workers? Let me get my clickers working. Hey, as I do that as well, I want to let you know I'm looking specifically at my notes and the slides right here. This is the land of Zoom. I have got the information about all the questions in the roster in the chat right here, and I've got a different version of the slides over here. So if I'm looking left to right, side to side, it's not out of disrespect. It's that I'm trying to pay attention to you and all of the information that I've got here, and that's in multiple places. All right, let's dig into this data to give you some trends and insights on the world of work in the US and some additional specific insights into Generation Z, the subsection of that group. We like to make sure that everyone who sees our data knows that it's sound data. It's not really straight up marketing research data or marketing data. It's social science. We partnered with the Harris Poll Company to conduct this survey of over 5,000 members of the US workforce. Our survey was conducted in late November, early December of last year, and we asked them to generate a response group that looked like demographically the US workforce so that we would be able to subdivide the data and see how different groups within the workforce are similar or different to each other in the way they respond. And we're going to share some of those similarities and differences, the general population and how it compares to the Generation Z population that is populating all of your schools right now. To do that, let's just give you a little bit of the demographics to tell you what I mean by that. Now, I'm going to zip through some of these slides pretty quickly, particularly the demographic stuff, and I'm going to dwell on other slides as well. But you're going to have access to this recording afterwards so you can gain all of this information or watch it again later. So let's dig in. This is what I mean by surveying over 5,000 people. 5,000 people distributed across the US, in all of its different regions, as well as urban, suburban, rural. And all of these different subdivisions are ways that we can parse this data. Doesn't mean I can do it on the fly as a part of this presentation, but we do want you to know just how diverse this data set is. We're looked at folks by generations, and you can see that Gen Z made up 15% of our response group, or about 765 respondents. On these slides, I want you to be familiar with what you're seeing, and I want you to understand the veracity of the data. You can see on this slide, under the generation slide, you see an N. Every slide will have an N on it so that you will know the size of the response group. And when I'm comparing the general population data to the Gen Z data, I am going to share the Gen Z data parenthetically below. So you'll see an N in parentheses. That's going to be the Gen Z data. Now, generally speaking, we won't share data unless we believe we have statistically significant responses. And by our definition, that's usually over 200 responses. I am going to share a couple of Gen Z data points that are a little below that, but I'll point that out. I just like to do that for the researchers that might be in our group who are going to scrutinize this data as well they should. Okay, let me continue. Looking at it by generation, looking at it by age ranges, this is our current group. I told you we were going to compare this to Generation Z, and 2 years ago, we did a study specifically of Generation Z. We surveyed 1,000 members of Generation Z, also distributed across the US. And there's going to be a few points in here where I am going to share data, questions that we asked in both surveys so that you can see how they compare. I'm doing this because when I shared this data at NACE back in June, I talked about this data, but I didn't have it at hand, and I had questions about it, so we included it here. So you're going to see 3 different data types in this presentation. The general population data of the 5,000 plus respondents of the whole survey. You will see the subsection of that is Generation Z's responses, and then you will, in a few areas, see responses that came from our survey of 2 years ago, which was also looking at Generation Z. Digging deeper into those demographics again, male and female breakdowns, breakdown by education levels. We even looked at breakdowns by ethnicity, as well as what we at Indeed call job seekers facing barriers. We've got a commitment at Indeed to help all people get jobs, and to particularly help job seekers facing barriers. And to that end, we've got a 5-year goal of helping, I believe it's 30 million job seekers facing barriers get jobs. This is what we mean by job seekers facing barriers. These are members of our workforce that have additional challenges that we are trying to help. Individuals with disabilities, criminal records, serving in the military, members of a variety of different communities that you can see on this slide. And we can dice and slice the data by these groups as well, just as we can dice and slice it by the different segments of the workforce, as well as household income. I told you I was going to go through the demographic stuffs really quickly at the front end, and I did, just to give you an idea of how we can look at this. So if down the road you're ever interested in seeing one subsection of this, we might be able to help you out with that specific data. Excuse me, that's the big key findings. Let's dig into those. What did we generally learn about the US workforce when we conducted this survey? Maybe surprising to you, I don't know. 71% of the US workforce says they're open to new opportunities. 80% of Generation Z said that they're open to new opportunities. Now, exactly how did we measure this? It was on a 10-point scale, and I've got a slide that breaks that down further for you. But this generally reinforces things we have seen in the past, that if you combine the active and the passive workforce, most people in the US workforce are open to considering new opportunities, and they certainly were at the time that we did this survey. We also, a little surprisingly, saw that nearly 70% of the workforce and 75% of Gen Z were optimistic at that time that they were going to be able to find good job prospects in 2024. Now, I will share, we did this survey between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So at a time of year, I think when people are thinking about renewal, new starts to the year, that can lend perhaps a greater degree of optimism, but it's also the holidays, and sometimes the very opposite can be true. I think if we do this study, or when we do this study again in the future, we will probably choose a more neutral time of year to ask these questions. That said, at that time, 69% were optimistic, and 75% of Gen Z were optimistic as well. Kind of runs a little counter, I think, to some of the stories that you see in the media around the state of the workforce. And honestly, we've asked different kinds of questions around this topic, and sometimes they conflict as well. But we can share with you that according to our survey, most people were optimistic about their job prospects in 2025. This is a data point that doesn't exactly excite me, and I'm going to share a little more depth on this, but it says that only about half, and even less than half, of Gen Z say they're updating their resumes more than once a year, or only when they're gearing up for a job search. Now, I'm not surprised by this, but I'm disappointed by it, because we live in a world where an opportunity may come upon you that you want to be able to seize upon, or you may be pushed into a position of having to look for work, as we've seen through some sorts of layoffs. And the notion of not paying attention to it until we really have to doesn't help us in those situations. We would advocate, I personally, that lifelong career management makes a lot more sense, and that lifelong career management means always having your resume ready and up to date. My recommendation on that is at least every 3 months. This is also, I think, a positive thing, that more than half of US workers, and a little higher tick up on Gen Z, agree they're researching every company before they apply. Not some, but every company before they apply. As career services practitioners, I think that means we've got to be making sure we're connecting them with resources that help them do that research as they apply. And as employers, I think it means we have to be managing our employer brand so that when job seekers are researching us, they're finding good information and the information that they need as well. What is holding people back? Similar percentages here, 49% for the general population and 45% for Gen Z, agree that most application processes are too long and complicated. We would agree with that at Indeed, because we've studied the application processes of the Fortune 500 and found that many of them are very, very long, and the longer the application process, the greater the applicant fall off. So I think there's a message here for employers in their application processes, the candidate journey. I think there's a message here for career services professionals and the candidate journey that we are expecting of our students and our alumni engaging with the online services that we're offering. Are we creating more barriers than job seekers are willing to accept in their search for internships, jobs, and the like? What's holding people back? A higher percentage, nearly 10% higher, of Gen Z, 47%, over the 38% of the general workforce, say that they would stop and abandon the application process if salary information isn't there. This is really important. It's a reason why we have a dynamic salary database on Indeed. It's why NACE does their annual salary surveys. This is becoming more important. And as you can see in the statistics, it's becoming even more important to Gen Z. This is a generation that will talk much more transparently and openly about their salary and salary equity, and the need for salary transparency. So this data reinforced other research that we are doing at Indeed. Those were the key findings broadly. We talked about the state of the workforce as well. We looked at worker motivations, we looked at worker experiences, and we looked at barriers. And now we're going to jump into those things. State of the workforce, some of it I'll go by quickly as well, because it's just helping us really understand where we are, or in this case, where we were starting 2024. The employment status report that we got really mirrored the BLS labor data as well, around 70% employment. You can see those numbers change a bit for Gen Z, not surprisingly, because we're going to have a number of people who are in school or otherwise not yet fully in the workforce, giving the age range of Generation Z. And you can see the unemployed rate hovering there, looking across the generations between 3 and 5%. 29%, of course, of Gen Z being full-time enrolled as students. I share that saying, remember when we did this study, this was not a study of 18 to 24-year-olds going to college, which is a narrower subsection of the workforce, or even the entire US workforce that went to college. This is meant to capture the entire workforce, so that when you're looking at these data, keep that in mind. That's why we can do things like show what the seniority is, or how that breaks down across the workforce. When you're coaching and talking to students and alumni, so that they can get an idea of how many different types of people are in different types of organizations and at what levels within those organizations. How many people right now are in the early, mid, and late stages of their career as we move forward? This was a question that I have wanted to ask for a really, really long time, because I have leaned into the BLS statistic around number of jobs. And the BLS has long said, and it's been a very consistent statistic, that over the course of their prime work years, the typical US worker, and by the way, the prime work years are 18 to 54. And truth be told, I'm outside of my prime work years and I'm still working and going strong. So that's a limitation on their data. But within their prime work years, they say that the typical US worker will have 12.4 jobs. So I wanted to see if we could validate that. And I wanted to add in the question around how many career changes, because we know that in addition to job changes, people change careers. This is what we learned. I love this chart on the left, because it shows that when you go across the generations, you see the number of jobs do go up. The change slows a little bit as they get a little bit older, but it's not uncommon to have 9 to more than 20 different jobs over the course of a career, and to work in as many as 3 or 4 different career areas, maybe even sometimes 5. To me, this validated the statement that I've been making for a long time, that the typical worker will have somewhere between 9 and 15 different jobs and work in 2 to 5 wholly different career areas over the course of their work life. And they'll work in some areas later in their career that don't exist earlier in their career. I love this data because it helps counter this notion that still prevails, that we're supposed to have this figured out when we're in high school or college, and we're supposed to pursue a linear career path. Because we get fed that by parents, grandparents, as an expectation or a desire. It's more the exception than it is the rule. And now we have some data that helps support the argument against that perception.
Matt, can I jump in with a question here? I'm so
You
sorry
certainly
to
may.
interrupt. Janine asked a question in the chat. Do you happen to know whether the number of jobs that are listed here include multiple jobs at the same employer? Does that mean just external moves?
No, in fact, it can be multiple jobs within the same employer. We don't have that broken down here, but we did go into saying, were these jobs with the same employer or did we change? The numbers get very small when we start looking at that. So we went with these high level numbers. These job changes can be with the same employer. The career change question that we ask really touches more on that broader transition, because what we saw is that when you're changing careers, it often comes with a change of employers. So I think that if we're trying to look at the change of employers, the change of careers is a better number to lean into, though it's not specific about change of employers. The changing jobs does not mean changing employers, because someone could work for the same company for 5-10 years and have a number of jobs. I've been with Indeed now over 8 years, and I'm on job number 3. So that's a really good question. Jennifer, thank you for, Janine, excuse me, thank you for asking that question. And Bridget, thanks for bringing it to my attention. Let's keep going. How do people describe their work? Across the workforce, you can see we do lean heavily into knowledge workers, then service, manual labor, and some folks who find themselves in other areas. And this kind of caught my surprise. It took me a little bit by surprise, particularly when we hear about people who aren't happy in their work, don't like their jobs, don't like their bosses, perhaps. 81% of the people that we surveyed generally said they like their job when they were asked to describe their current work situation. Some of them not exactly happy with their employer, but a full 65% said they're both happy with their job and happy with their employer. And I found that heartening. I like positive data myself. Let's talk about career path for a second. And when we're looking at Gen Z, you can see that it's a little bit different, a little bit lower in terms of workers wanting to continue in their current career path. The parenthetical numbers on top are the Gen Z numbers. The numbers within the bars are the general population numbers. And this does not surprise me, because when we're earlier in our career, we are still trying to figure out where it is we think we might want to go and whether or not we're on the right career path, and people tend to make more changes early on. So I would expect those numbers to be exactly the way they are for Gen Z, a little bit lower, but it is nice to see generally that 77% of workers surveyed say they'd like to continue in their current career path. Let's talk about pay for a second. We've done all kinds of things over the past years to promote pay transparency at Indeed, to make salary information available, to encourage employers to add salary information to their postings. And frankly, there are some states who have made it the law that they have to include that. And I think personally, that's a pretty good thing. How do people feel about their pay? Very nice to see that 75% of the general population feel that they're paid at or above industry standards. Very disappointing to see that the pay disparity still exists. A BLS survey, I think of a year or two ago, said that women are currently being paid 82 cents on the dollar, that men are being paid for the same work at the same level. And that is a disparity that we need to close. And a way we can work towards closing that is through salary transparency. And on some levels, this is getting a little bit better, but we can do better. But it is nice to see that 3/4 of people said they're being paid at or above industry standards, and that only 4% don't know or don't know how to compare that. That's a number we'd love to see come down as well. Let's look at structure of work, the notion of, gosh, with companies requiring some folks to go back to work in office all or most of the time. We've seen this stuff on the news about Amazon and other companies doing this. The notion of on-site versus hybrid versus remote, what were people doing at the time? Well, you see that spelled out on the screen. Interestingly, you look at the numbers for Gen Z, they skew a little more heavily to on-site. There's some good reasons for that, I would suggest, in that earlier in their career, companies are bringing people on site so that they can train and coach them into their culture and monitor their activities a little more effectively. But another side to that is a real desire on the part of Gen Z for live human interaction and FaceTime. This is the generation that spent much of their high school and much of their college years on computer terminals by themselves, interacting with the world through screens. And some of them, many of them, one might argue, are craving more of that interaction. We will look a little further in here at what their desired work situations are, but this gives you an idea of what at the end of the year the current situation was for most workers in terms of on-site, remote, and hybrid, and what that means in terms of number of days in the office. I mentioned earlier the notion of being optimistic about being able to find better work, and I was going to provide the additional detail, and here it is. 69% of our population said they're optimistic about finding better work. You can see parenthetically the data for Generation Z. What this means is that 76% of Gen Z were optimistic. And if you look at the very top of that, just the 9 and the 10 on that, 36% were very optimistic, I would say, rating that as a 9 or a 10. Millennials are right there in the exact same place, 76 and then 35 at 9 or 10. It starts going down for Gen Xers at 67%, and then baby boomers rounded out at 50%. 50% of Gen Z, of baby boomers were optimistic about their opportunities to find better work in 2024. A couple of sort of wow type stats we like to put out there, just asking agree or disagree questions. 39% of the general population said they felt generally burned out by their work. That percentage was higher, 45% for Generation Z. 35%, and it was across the board for all pretty much, said that work put a great deal of stress on their home life, and 61% of our workforce said that their employer's culture allowed them to thrive professionally. It's nice to say 61% do. It also is sad to say that 39% don't. It's just the flip side of that statistic. 76% of the workforce, lower by more than by 12 points for Gen Z, 76% said they were proud to tell their families about what they do for a living. See, we draw a lot of our identity from our work, and taking pride in what we do is very important. And it's nice to see that 3/4 of people said that they were interested or proud of what they do, and they were happy to tell their folks what they do for a living. 53% of our respondents said their companies had defined career paths or career progressions for their role that they're in. Now, that was higher for Generation Z. Challenging sometimes for companies across all roles to offer this career progression. So I would just, looking at my own experience working with job seekers and with employers, say that this is a statistic that I would expect, and I was a little surprised personally that the number was more than 10 points higher, 11 points higher for Generation Z. Let's talk a little bit about motivations, because we ask these questions about whether or not workers want to search for new work. The breakdown that I shared would be coming a little bit later. 71% said that they were open to new opportunities. This is how that broke down. You can see there's a higher percentage of Generation Z looking within the next 3 months, and that is not 111%, that's 11%. I saw that typo when I delivered this presentation last week, and I failed to take that extra 1 out. That's 11%. So Bridget, remind me to take that typo out before we do this the next time, or else my numbers are really, really skewed. So higher percentage looking in the next 3 months, about the same in the next 12 months. And when you combine occasionally and would consider, it's about the same. Generally speaking, it's a more optimistic group in terms of seeking out new opportunities, sort of being a part of the active and the passive job force. What are they looking for when they're looking for work? When we asked everyone this question, what are your top priorities, your top job search motivators? It was higher pay, better benefits, and flexible hours. And this is pretty consistent with the study that we did earlier as well. Let's look at the overall top motivators themselves. You see, this is a big slide with a lot of data. Feel free to screen capture anything that you want, but high pay, better benefits, more flexible hours. But then you start seeing some interesting things. Higher stress levels at my company, a desire for greater flexibility, a better company culture. These are non-tangible things that are not going to show up in a job description. It's why more and more workers are researching every company before they apply. But across the board, the top 3 by far were higher pay, better benefits, better benefits and more flexibility. I wanted to compare this to what we saw from the Gen Z study that we did 2 years ago. So I pulled out the data from that. In this case, it's that group of 1,000 respondents. And you can see with them, with Gen Z, flexible work schedule, job security, compensation, work environment, job that makes me feel valued, and benefits were right up there near the top. So you see a lot of priorities that are very, very consistent between these two studies. And it's interesting when you look at the breakdown here on Gen Z, that job security was significantly more important for older Gen Z. Makes sense because they're out there working, they're getting their career started. But a safe work environment was significantly more important to Gen Z females we surveyed than it was to Gen Z males. Again, work environment, work culture, the safety and security aspect of it. Gen Z really puts their values into action. They said in our current study and in our last study that they valued flexibility. In our last study, 54% of our respondents said they wouldn't accept a job unless it offered flexible scheduling. Not completely remote, but flexible scheduling. And they're willing to make the trade-offs that are necessary for that, because 57% said they would actually accept a job that pays less if it did offer flexible scheduling or some kind of remote work. I think Gen Z is aware that there are trade-offs that they have to make in the world of work. They're approaching work differently, but they're approaching it with a level of flexibility that I don't necessarily know all previous generations were in their definition of work and where work fits into their lives. These data, as you can see on the slide, are from the Gen Z survey we did back in 2022. Okay, let's talk about desired work arrangement. Remember in the earlier slide, we talked about what's your current situation. In this question, or these two questions, we asked them what they would prefer. You can see a third of Gen Z prefers to work in a hybrid role. Those numbers are a little bit higher for Gen Z when it comes to on-site, higher than that 23% as well. Right now, just for comparison, to call back, 26% are working hybrid, 21% of Gen Z are working hybrid, 26% of millennials, 27% of Gen Z, and 24% of baby boomers when we look at this. So you can see what they're looking for is a little different than what they currently have, but it really leans into this notion of flexibility and being there to do the work when it needs to get done and being elsewhere when they've completed what their assignments and what their work obligations are. So we said it can mean different things. So we asked this question about what they would like in terms of hybrid work. And you're seeing most folks are leaning into the 3-day in work week. You can see some with 2, some with 4. The idea behind this really is they completed much of their schooling online, remotely. And so they don't necessarily understand the requirement for being in a physical place to get a job done when physical proximity doesn't necessarily matter to the task at hand. For Gen Z, it's not about presence, it's about completion and performance. So if I've completed what I've done and I can do that from wherever, I'd like the flexibility to be able to do that. If I've completed what my assignments are, a belief that the reward for doing that should not necessarily be more work because I'm present. They would like the flexibility that goes along with that. This is the evolving definition of flexibility that I am seeing through the 2 studies that we have done in what Gen Z in particular, but workers in general, are looking for in work as we move into the future. Let's see, relocation. I think I was a little surprised by this. I didn't think there would be as many people open to relocation as this indicates. Only 31% saying they're not open to it. But remember, there's a number of people who said, I'll only consider relocating to certain places. So that I read this one, I would say, with a certain grain of salt, because relocation involves costs and not all companies are going to provide the cost of those relocations. But leaning into flexibility and remote work, we saw during COVID, there were a lot of folks who chose a location that suited them best because they could work remotely, and they've gotten used to that. And they've gotten used to performing under those circumstances, so they seek that out as well. 60% of the folks that we surveyed said it was easy to identify employers who offered a work environment where they could thrive. It means 40% couldn't. We think people are finding this kind of information on employers' careers pages, on our company pages, on places like Glassdoor, a sister company of ours, reading the reviews, looking at things like our work well-being score to understand by their own definition whether or not they feel they can thrive in that organization. And 63% said it was easy for them to find employers where they thought they would fit in. Personal fit. We do this workshop, and I'm doing it actually again next week for the Eskenazi Health Group and the Gregory Firebach Center is an organization that helps job seekers with disabilities seek out employment. The number here is not quite as high for job seekers with disabilities requiring accommodations. Regardless of who you are, the desire to fit in is really, really important. And it's nice to know that more than a majority of folks say it's easy for them to find places where they believe they can fit in. But this also still says 37% are struggling with that. So it's something to think about. Are we offering workplaces, and is the information, the pictures, and the stories that we're sharing as we talk about the workplace that we offer, do they offer an image that someone can look at and say, I can see myself in that world? I think it's a good reflective question for us to have as we think about recruiting talent. 55% of the folks we surveyed confirmed that employers are sharing their recruiting processes during the interview and typically how long the interview takes. This number should be higher. We're always coaching, Bridget and I and Clint, when we're doing our Job Search Academy sessions or coaching job seekers in interviews. Never leave an interview without asking about what the next steps are. But why should they have to ask? Shouldn't that be a standard part of every interview so that we are bringing the job seeker along in the journey and we're not leaving them in the dark? The black hole problem was identified by job seekers when we surveyed them a number of years as being one of the most frustrating parts of the job search. Reaching out or getting into a process and then never hearing back. This number should be much higher, and to me, it's disappointing that it's only 52%. All right, let's get into their experiences. What is it like for them as they're seeking out their next roles? Some of this stuff echoes slides we've already had. 56% saying they're regularly consulting employee reviews. That's very consistent with the more than 50% who said they're researching every single employer. The number ticks up just a little bit for Gen Z. 60%, 71% of Gen Z agreeing that they're keeping their eyes open for new opportunities and they're staying prepared to apply. I am going to challenge that a little bit because we asked different sorts of questions in there. Remember how we asked them the question about how frequently do you update your resume and how frequently do we update our professional profiles? 50% of the population at best is doing that more often than once a year. Yet 60% said they're always keeping their eyes open, and 71% of Gen Z say they're always keeping their eyes open. They're not as prepared as I think they're believing that they are when it comes to that. And then additionally, 49% finding application processes too long. Gen Z not expressing as much frustration about that, but nonetheless, there is some frustration around that. Talked about those resume data. Here it is in greater detail. You can see when it comes to the general population and then parenthetically Gen Z, we've got such a small percentage, 10% keeping their resume really, really up to date. Another 25% of the general population, or 37% of Gen Z, keeping it up to date every 6 months, and then another quarter, roughly a year at most. And then 30%, 40% only when they're searching for a job or not even having a resume altogether. As career coaches, this is a behavior I think we want to try and encourage workers to change, because workers should always be prepared to share their most current qualifications and accomplishments, because everyone has performance reviews, and we want to tie those activities together. Personal reflection on their experience and accomplishments and skill development that translates into our online profiles and resumes which makes us better prepared to look for work. So when we think about resumes transitioning into professional profiles, you see data that closely parallels what you saw with resumes. A little bit higher, actually, when it comes to the professional profiles. But these days, those two things go hand in hand, because chances are an employer is going to see your online resume, which is essentially your online profile, sooner than they're going to see the paper resume that you're pushing across the desk. And that paper resume that you're pushing across the desk is the same one that you are uploading into employer applicant tracking systems and into systems like Indeed. We really want to try and encourage people to be more proactively manage their careers over the course of the long haul. Remember that data about number of job changes and number of career changes that people make. It happens on a regular basis. The only way we are prepared as workers and job seekers for those changes is if our story is ready to tell. Where are people going when they are looking for jobs? What are their top resources when they're looking for a job? Job search websites like Indeed, company websites like those that most large companies do have, going to Google, then friends, family, networking. I do not want career services folks on this call to be discouraged by the fact that only 9% say they're going to their school career center or career advisor, because remember, this is the entire population. Look at parenthetically, 20% of Gen Z are going to their school career advisors. And if you look at the percentage of Gen Z that is pursuing a college degree right now, I think that this data is probably pretty spot on with what we are looking at in terms of the activities that career centers are getting, the action that they're getting from their students. We like to share this, of course, because this data makes Indeed look good. I do want to share, when we did this survey, or I should say when Harris Poll did this survey for us, they did not say this was a survey for Indeed. So this question is not loaded in that way where people could say, oh, this is Indeed survey, I want to talk about Indeed. But we came up on top, even higher for Gen Z, 76% of the, or 74% of the general population, 80% of Gen Z, about the same for LinkedIn, 36 and 37, Zip, Google, you can see the rest that go down the line. It does not surprise me that systems like Simplicity and Handshake do not appear on this list, because again, this survey is of the broader general population, not of the college population only. So they're going to show up in a much smaller number in this regard anyway. So I do not believe this data is a reflection of that. I think one of the reasons that we stand out, and with this piece of data, ComScore, a tech company that measures online traffic, says that 96% of the US workforce is reached by Indeed, while 57% is reached by LinkedIn. This makes sense to me because Indeed is working and supporting job seekers across the employment spectrum, whether you do or don't have a high school or college degree, or whether you are starting your career coming out of high school, or you're deep into your 60s or 70s and still working. It's a broader population served by Indeed than I think is by LinkedIn. And that's why our reach. It also says that your students and your alumni are all probably using Indeed already. So it's a good idea to be aware of the resources that Indeed has so that you will be ready when your students and your alumni ask. All right, let's keep going on this stuff because we're making good time, and we got about 15 minutes left before we move on. How many companies do people apply to? I think it's important to get an idea and to give the job seekers that you work with the number of companies and the number of interviews that you're encountering. Our general population, you can see these numbers. These are questions that we only asked of people who are or have recently been in a job search. So you can see the N on this is significantly lower. It's the 608 people that we're actively seeking. You can see where the numbers fall, anywhere between 1 and more than 20 companies, and the number of interviews that people are taking before they get a job. What does that mean with Gen Z? The numbers skew a little bit lower, but you can see that it does range widely, more than 60%, 64%, up to 5 companies, and then you can see how the numbers distribute from that, and the number of interviews, again, leaning towards 1 to 3 amongst Generation Z. I wish I were more encouraged by what I see on this slide, but I'm not, and I have spent a lifetime trying to combat this. People aren't spending enough time on their job search. I have long said that if you are not working, your full-time job should be looking for a job, not a 24/7 job, but a full-time job, 38 to 40 hours a week, which means you're budgeting your time during a work week to do the proactive and the reactive things you need to look for work. And when you have other responsibilities like a family or a job or going to school, you need to budget a certain amount of time. Less than 50% of the general population and nearly 70% of Gen Z said they're spending 6 or fewer hours per week on their job search. When we're not making progress, perhaps it's because we're not putting in the time that is necessary to make a job change, or the extra time that I believe is often necessary when you're trying to make a career pivot as well. For a little bit of context, 27% of the respondents said that they're spending between 7 and 15 hours a week, and only 17% said they were spending more than 15 hours a week. 68% of Gen Z spending 6 hours or less on their job search. You get the return on your investment, you might say. So hopefully you can use this statistic in your coaching to encourage job seekers, the ones you're working with, to invest a little bit more time in their job search. We've talked a number of times and through a variety of data points on the amount of research that job seekers are doing. And you can see that summarized here. The big number we shared earlier, 54% researching every company. Well, 88% of people are doing at least some research. When you factor in those, when they read and research just some companies, and there's only 12% not doing any kind of research. They're scrutinizing opportunities and employers before they apply. In fact, when we asked this question 2 years ago of Gen Z, 58% said they wouldn't even accept a new job offer before looking and reading employee reviews. So think about this. They're looking at reviews before they even apply to a job to assess the job and to assess the employer. Then when they're getting a job offer, they're looking at those reviews again to determine whether or not they want to accept the job offer. It's not a one-time activity. The behavior that we have all become accustomed to when we're shopping on Amazon, or we're looking at Yelp for a restaurant, or we're considering vacation destinations and looking at reviews on Google. We scrutinize and agonize over $5, $10, $15, $30 purchases on Amazon. We do the same thing when it comes to a career, something that is going to take up a lot of our time, a lot of our energy, and a lot of our attention. It makes sense. And that to me is why it makes sense for career centers to be coaching job seekers, their students, on how to do this, and why it's very important for employers to be managing their employer brand on their company pages, on their messaging to the emerging workforce, on places like Indeed and Glassdoor and other places where people are providing reviews and where employers have the opportunity to share their story with potential employees. 34% of our respondents look to see if employer reviews match the claims. See, they're doing this with a level of sophistication. They're looking at what they see on an employer's company careers page, and they're comparing it to what they see in reviews. Do those stories align, or do they conflict? These are things to pay attention to as an employer. What are folks looking for when they are doing that research? Well, this aligns with their priorities. They're looking for salary information. They're looking for benefits. And then look at this. Overall employee happiness, overall rating, and workload are at the top. Look at the numbers. They're kind of small parenthetically underneath that. Gen Z, 8 points higher on workload, a little bit lower on overall rating, higher for employer happiness, a little bit lower on each of those. But the one thing on this slide that really, really stands out, or two for that matter, is the higher percentage for Gen Z when it looks at workload. See, this gets back to that flexibility, and they're not looking for the reward for getting done early and doing a good job of being just more work. They want that flexibility in managing their workload. And then look at the interview process, a full 10% higher. They want to understand what they are getting themselves into, and that begins with the interview process and not just the job itself. Where are people looking for this information? Largely, they're coming to Google and they're coming to us. After that, LinkedIn, then your company's career page, then Glassdoor, and other areas as well. There's a lot of different places that people can look, but they're going to some of the most common resources, and these might be good resources in terms of the coaching and advising that career coaches do with the students and the alumni and other job seekers they advise. During their most current job search, how did they prepare? No great surprises here, no great insights. I don't think these are respondents who've been in their job for less than a year or are recently unemployed and seeking. Gives you an idea. We asked this question because we wanted to get some benchmark data primarily on how this is changing a little bit. You'll see 11% down at the bottom already say they're using online resources like ChatGPT and Bard in their research. We actually did a webinar earlier this year in July on AI tools for your job search. And there's some great resources that are out there to help you do that. But largely it's reviewing their experience in their resume and then searching online for the kinds of questions that they want. So if you're coaching students, hopefully this can be a guidance to the way you're developing programming around your interview preparation workshops. We have certainly done that in the workshops that we provide through Indeed's Job Search Academy. All right, we're into our last 8 minutes. We're going to do a couple more and run into a couple of the barriers, but we're getting very, very close. The majority of workers say they're hearing back from companies within a week of applying. This leans into this notion of not wanting to be left in the black hole, and that is somewhat heartening to see that. And not surprisingly, most say that positively impacts their interest in that employer. But it's a little different. Only half or so said it negatively impacts their impression of an employer or their interest in a company if they are slower on the uptake. Some fun stuff around ghosting. 23% said they have been ghosted by an employer, and 33% of Gen Z said that has happened to them. Back in our old survey, 53% of Gen Z said that they had been ghosted in the past year by a recruiter. So a significantly higher number 2 years ago. Questions weren't asked identically, but they were asked in very, very similar manners. So it was a much higher number 2 years ago than it is now. Turnabout is fair play. So we want to make sure we see the other side of that. 13% said that they have ghosted someone. 17% of Gen Z. How was that 2 years ago? Almost double. Well, it actually was double. Then 34% of Gen Z said that they had ghosted a recruiter. I am not going to be so bold as to say this is a trend. It's just two different points in time. I won't say that we've gotten much better about ghosting either on either side. I will share that it remains an issue, but hopefully this is an indication that it's getting a little bit better. Okay, our final section as we come into the last 6 minutes or so that we have, barriers. What is holding people back in their job search? Barriers, qualifications, not necessarily having the certifications or the formal education that they need or the technical skills and work experience. I doubt that there's a lot of deep aha insights into this, but it's important to remember how important certifications, education, specific technical skills are, all more important than the formal work experience. Because as we know, as career coaches and educators in that regard, there are a lot of ways to get experience so that you get to enter the workforce with experience that do not involve necessarily being in work or paid internship type roles. There's lots of ways to gain that applied experience. Part of our job is to help connect job seekers and students with those opportunities. This is a slide that I would encourage you to screen capture now, or if you watch the recording later, because I think it's super important. We asked them to identify personal barriers that they were having to overcome trying to find a job. And I want you to look at the things at the very, very top. The first listing for everyone, and 11 points higher for Gen Z, is the anxiety or nervousness when it comes to finding a job. Part of our job in career services is to demystify the process of finding a job and pursuing a career for the people who we work with so that we can help bring that anxiety level down. This is data to prove that it's something we really need to look at. Lack of prior work experience or lack of the right job. On the previous slide, I just talked a little bit about that and how we need to coach job seekers for a different definition of what it means to have experience. getting a little further down that list, helping them tell their story about the skills that they have and and understand what it is that they offer. Finding job postings down the list, interview processes, we've seen all of that. I won't go through all of these. I just wanted to share those top ones to draw attention to that aspect of it. The whole process, the experience, the job seeker experience remains a problem. Back in our last survey, nearly 50% of Gen Z said they're not even going to apply to a job when they know it requires 3 separate in-person interviews. Make a decision is ultimately what they're saying, is make good use of your time, make good use of my time. This could be a barrier. Let's look at the interview processes that we are asking or require job seekers to go through. And you can see what else is going to cause them out of the current research that we did. What's going to cause people to abandon an application process? No salary data. There's that application functionality again. Simple professionalism. Are there spelling or grammar errors or mistakes in the job description? I reflect on that one because I'm still thinking about that 111% I had on a previous slide that should have just been 11. You got to get that fixed. Extensive questions that we don't feel we need to answer early in an application process. All of these are greater than seeing the degrees, recommended degrees needed. Many of these are barriers that employers can remove for job seekers and open the door for more qualified job seekers to come on in. And our final slide in terms of data for today, what barriers are workers facing when it comes to negotiation, information, what is and isn't negotiable, competition, and then lack of negotiation skills. Now, we do workshops on this. I know most schools will do workshops on this as well, trying to help people develop these skills. These are lifelong skills we want to help people develop. So it's super important that we do that. I want to land on this slide really quickly before I sort of just go into a couple of informational slides, because it's some insights that we have developed into Gen Z over the course of 3 or 4 years of studying this generation. And I like to share these. We as a company wanted to know really who they are, what they care about, and how they act, because that influences how they consume information, how they pursue job opportunities, and how they perform in the workforce. So I think we always want to remain cognizant. Some of these things we know that they are the first true digital natives. It almost feels as if they were born with an iPhone or an Android in their hand. And that is a way they don't see a reason why you shouldn't be able to flow between online and in-person seamlessly. I call it the Warby Parker, phenomenon. You can interact with them whether in store or online, however you want. They are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation we have yet, and chances are they will be surpassed by Generation Alpha when we start measuring them into the workforce, but that is an indication of just how diverse, the diversity that they're bringing into the workforce and they are expecting from their jobs and from their employers. You can see that in the way that they incorporate their social causes and the fact that they prioritize them into what they do and that they seek to find alignment in their work and in their life outside of work. There are generations, I would say mine, I'm a boomer Gen X cusper, where we would try to compartmentalize our lives and separate completely our work from our home and other things. Gen Z in general does not want to do that. They're seeking to align their activities inside and outside of work with their values. And then they demand personalization and flexibility in what they get. They know that they're being watched and that their activities are being monitored by algorithms. And as a result of that, they're expecting a personalization in the experience that they have online with the organizations that they interact with. They do respond well to influence and influencers, and they will have a bias toward action in what they do. These things challenge the norms of the workforce as they have been around. And I think they challenge them in a good way. Gen Z is going to have to adapt to the workforce, but the workforce is going to have to adapt to Gen Z as well. And I certainly hope these data points have been helpful. As we get ready to wrap, I know at the top of the hour, Bridget has already shared the link to the broader report that we have. We've got a bunch of additional information in this slide deck on Indeed, where you can get information that we are providing to employers. You can get information from our hiring lab that produces a lot of information and articles. And we have data on the actual flow of jobs in the workforce, job postings, wages, and the volume of remote work opportunities that are out there. And lastly, as we get ready to close, we have a workshop, an information session on our Job Search Academy partner program. We've got nearly 90 universities across the country signed up as a Job Search Academy partner. It's a free partnership that allows you to incorporate Indeed's resources into your programming as a supplement to the main work that you do. We're going to share the link to that. Bridget just did that on how you can get into that data. But it's it's on Halloween. You don't have to wear a costume. I won't be wearing one. 2 p.m. Eastern. That makes it 1 p.m. Central, and it makes it 11 o'clock in the morning out where I am on the West Coast. This is where I would say it's time for questions, and I'm happy to take additional questions for folks who want to stick around. But I do know this was budgeted for an hour, so if you have to leave, you won't hurt my feelings. I hope this information was valuable to you. But Jenny, if we do have time, and Zoe, if we want to take some questions, I am happy to take those questions now.
So absolutely. I unfortunately have to drop off. Busy day. I have another meeting. I did want to very quickly just thank Matt and Brigitte for being here and taking time to present to all of you and share all this great data and information with us. So if we could give them a virtual round of applause. Thank you both so much for being here. Feel free to stay on and take questions. I'm going to bid you all goodbye and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Jenny.
Feel free to stay. Thank you guys so much.
Wonderful. So friends, Bridget and I can stick around and take some questions if you have them.
And if you would rather ask it live too, we can unmute you if you raise your hand and let us know.
We did have a question in the Q&A. It looks like most folks are dropping off, but there was a question in the Q&A earlier that I answered by chat just about the difference between the ghosting questions there, Matt. And I think from what I understand, it looked like one was being ghosted after an interview and the other was just being ghosted more generally based on the wording on the slide.
That is correct. We try to keep the wording on the slide as consistent with the wording in the question as we can. And we did ask the question about ghosting differently in the two surveys. So that is a very good insight in that there is going to be a difference there. In the most recent survey, we did not distinguish. In the earlier survey, we did.
Looks like that's it for questions, unless anybody has any others.
All right, friends, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this was valuable. If you have any questions, please do feel to reach out. I'm pretty easy to track down on LinkedIn. I know Bridget is as well. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.